Testing. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. My name is Russell Shao. I am the executive director here at GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and informed opinions about current developments related to Taiwan. We also organize public seminars, like the one that all of you are here participating in. And we also organize an annual symposium in the fall. In addition to these programs, we also offer scholarships and fellowship opportunities. And in addition to that, we also have a series of podcasts. I'm pleased to announce that actually we are gearing up to release our newest podcast, Taiwan Salon, which focuses on cultural policy and soft power. And our first episode will be released this Friday, featuring the Honorable Audrey Tang, who is Taiwan's digital minister. So if you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, please do so by visiting our website at globaltaiwan.org. I'll be remiss if I began today's program without thanking our co-founders, our directors, our advisors, as well as the staff and interns here at GTI who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. I'm truly delighted to be able to host the guest speaker for today's book talk, Ian Easton. He is the Senior Director at the Cross 2049 Institute. And also, in addition to being the author of the book that we'll be talking about today, he's the author of The Chinese Invasion Threat, Taiwan's Defense and American Strategy in Asia. He was previously a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs, as well as the China Analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses in Virginia. I'm truly excited to be able to have this conversation with Ian as part of this series that we have hosted, really examining various books written by visionary authors, I would say, who have been able to really highlight important strategic trends in U.S.-Taiwan relations, U.S.-China relations, and broader geopolitical developments affecting and related to Taiwan. In the past, we've been able to host book talks with the likes of Michael Green, his book on By More Than Providence. Also, just this year, a series of book talks with the likes of Albert Kobe, who wrote the book The Strategy of Denial, as well as most recently with Ryan Haas of the Brookings Institute on his book on competitive interdependence in U.S.-China relations. And so I think this is a wonderful way to be able to continue this series of book talks with Ian here about his book, The Final Struggle Inside China's Global Strategy. So without further ado, let me jump in. So Ian, as I always like to begin with these book talks, is I want to give the author an opportunity to really talk about, why you wrote this book and how did you come up with the title?
Okay, well, first and foremost, Russell, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks for having me here. Thanks to the entire team here at GTI. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I have not had the opportunity to do an in-person event in quite some time. And so it's really a thrill. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to be able to do this here today and to be able to talk about this new book. So why the book? Why the title? Where did the idea come from? A great question. So several years ago, the U.S. government came out with a new national security strategy. I think it was December of 2017, where we started to talk about strategic competition with the People's Republic of China. And that sparked this debate on how does the U.S. government see China? How do we see it? What is our understanding of what China's government and government plans mean for us? what is the future of strategic competition as we see it? That started a question in my mind, and it was, I wonder how Beijing sees it. I wonder if they have a version of our national security strategy. I wonder what their plan for strategic competition is, if they have one, and if they do, I wonder what that looks like. And so I started to dig into that idea a little bit further and to read books about Xi Jinping thought and to read Xi Jinping's own speeches to try to get a sense of how does the Chinese Communist Party as a political organization and how does Xi Jinping as the ruler of that organization and of the People's Republic of China, how do they see it? What's their vision for the future, and what does that vision mean for all of us?
We're definitely going to get into a lot of that conversation over the next hour. But before we do that, I want to kind of lead in with somehow the way that you sort of set the scene in the book itself, because I thought that was very telling in terms of how you described the sort of the nature of the challenge that we face from China's global strategy. You began with this story about the reach across America. So talk to us about the story and why you chose to lead with it.
Okay, so I don't want to give away too much, but the book opens with the story of America's longest and largest veterans parade. It's called Reach Across America. Every December, there is this very, very long veterans parade. It starts in Lubec, Maine, which is the easternmost settlement in the country, and they go through, I believe, 6 states, and they wind their way through. It's a very, very long caravan of large Chevy trucks and semi trailers that are packed with wreaths. And what they do is they come to Washington, D.C., they go up to Capitol Hill, and then they go back down Independence Avenue or Constitution Avenue, and they end up, the culminating moment of the parade is at Arlington National Cemetery. And they have a ceremony that they do at the tomb of the unknown soldier, where they lay a wreath before Christmas time. And this was something, and then they end up decorating all the graves at Arlington. And on the same weekend, across the country at veterans sites and at graveyards across the country and abroad, there are these ceremonies that are held like this. Now, I used to live just a few blocks away from Arlington National Cemetery, and year after year, I would see suddenly in December wreaths on all the graves, and I just thought that was a beautiful thing. And I wondered who did it, where did this come from? And so in early 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I was reading, and I forget what it was. I was reading about this company that's actually a sponsor of Reach Across America. It's a digital technology company that provide the radios. They're connected to the internet so that police officers and truck drivers and heavy bikers, because Rolling Thunder and some of the other patriotic biker groups also support this veterans parade, but they use these radios. And so I came across this and I was very curious, and I ended up clicking my way into the language menu that drops down. And I clicked into the Mandarin part because I was curious. And it turns out that this is a Chinese company called Haitera, Hainengda in Mandarin. And I started to read into this company, and I saw that their English language website has what I call an evil twin in Chinese, because you look at their English language website and it's beautiful, very patriotic, very pro-America. But then you go into their Chinese language website, it turns out they're a trusted supplier for China's military and China's political police services, the Public Security Bureau and others. And here they are sponsoring America's largest veterans parade. And so I tell that story, and then I start to talk about, okay, why does it matter? And how did we get to a point where even our most patriotic organizations, NGOs in America, are using Chinese technology companies that are directly linked to a genocidal regime?
Yeah, that's a good way to go. I was about to cut you off because I did want you to make sure that you don't get too much of the story. But no, but I want to go back to something that you alluded to at the very beginning, and this is really getting to the. We're going to start getting into the really meat of your analysis, which is really deep and broad. And so I think here you mentioned that you in order to study China's global strategy, went into the documents, and I'm going to give you a quick test right now. All right. So you alluded to that you were referencing documents. So tell me, can you reference all the internal documents that you counted that you cited in this book? I counted 13. So I'm going to see if we can get to 13.
No, I can't remember the title.
Yeah,
I can tell you who the publishers were and what
Okay.
they talked about. So for the internal, so the book draws, it's all open source research, but it does draw from a mix of internal Chinese Communist Party and PLA documents, and then stuff that I got on Amazon. Literally, during the pandemic, I couldn't travel. And so I would go on Amazon, and in Chinese, you could type in Xi Jinping thought, great power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics, and you could actually get books sent to your house. I did, from the Central Propaganda Department, from the Central Party School in Beijing, from Xinhua and other major publishers in Beijing. But there are also other documents I was able to get before the pandemic hit, primarily from China's National Defense University, and also some that were, for a brief period of time, available online. So from if you're familiar with the Thousand Talents program, they had a very large website with a lot of documents available that you could download for a time because they were out there, they were recruiting people, so they wanted everybody to know who they were, how to contact them, and what their plans were. So there were some planning documents from the Central Organization Department in Beijing that I was able to download and get a hold of and make copies of before it went offline, because eventually that went offline. And there were some other, like Zhongguancun, China's Silicon Valley, the tech hub in Beijing. They had documents that used to be available where they talked about military civil fusion and what some of China's leading technology companies like Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, ByteDance, the parent company for TikTok, their relationships with the PLA. But eventually that all went offline. And so now they are, I guess you could say, internal documents, but they work for a while there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such an important big service that you're providing in utilizing, Chinese language sources for your analysis, because so much of China analysis now, happens, without that type of expertise that you have Chinese language. And in addition to that, even if it were to be utilizing, Chinese materials, it would be the materials that are presented in their English websites. And as you referenced earlier, with regards to how, information is presented on an English website of a Chinese company versus what is represented in the Chinese language of the same company, they can be very different in terms of how they represent themselves and their intent. And this leads me to my next question with regards to analysis. And again, I'm going to focus a lot of our discussion on analysis because I think this is so important in our field. And then really one of the hardest aspects of China analysis is really deciphering intent. Right? I mean, I think when we look at capabilities, there are a lot of amazing sort of ship counters out there, missile counters, who can really sort of decipher a lot of, the types of the specs and the quantity and the range and the volume of, Chinese military capabilities. But it's much, much harder to decipher intent. And I think this field is really figuratively littered with the bones of a lot of analysts who tried to decipher intent, but failed miserably. And your book tackles this head on, and I think this represents really a brave attempt to get at the heart of China's underlying intent and its external manifestations, like what we hear now quite commonly, like the One Belt, One Road initiative, or like the community of common destiny. And I think you really cover this in great detail of how they're all interlinked, and that's what I drew a lot from in terms of how they were able to thread together these internal documents, what it meant, and these external manifestations of it that are so widely publicized and propagated, of course, by the PRC, right? So walk us through your thesis and your analysis without giving too much away.
Okay. So the methodology is actually really, really simple. It's not easy, but it's really simple. And this was how I was trained as a young analyst. I arrived in DC in 2010, and I was very lucky to have good mentors, Randy Shriver and Mark Stokes at the Project 2049 Institute. And they sat me down and they said, there's no secret to what we do at all. All you do is you read what the Chinese write from authoritative sources. So if you want to know what the PLA is doing, for example, or if you want to know what the CCP is doing, you just read what they write. Then you listen to what they say, because those might not be the same thing. So you listen to speeches, right? You watch the news in Mandarin, right? And then finally you watch what they do. Because sometimes things are written down and you have these planning documents and it's aspirational, but nothing actually comes of it. I think this happens, we know this very well in the think tank world, but this also happens in the US government as well, where you'll have documents, but they're never really put into action or put into practice. And so that's how I approached this book project. It seemed like an impossible task, right? I was trying to get inside the head of Xi Jinping and the collective brain of the Chinese Communist Party to decipher their intentions, their worldview, how they see America, what they want, and where they're going, and then of course to think about in the latter chapters of the book. So why does that matter for America? Why does that matter for us here in this room? And so I just started to read, and I just collected stacks and stacks and stacks of materials, textbooks, and planning documents, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 2-year action plans from the different ministries, speeches. And a lot of it is like paying for gold, where you're sitting in this really cold Colorado river and it's just muck and mud and you don't come across anything. And then you hit these little nuggets of gold, right? There'll be that little gold dust that'll be there. And so I would read a book like this, hundreds of pages, and I would come across a few paragraphs that would make it all worth it. But to get to those paragraphs, the key things, and these are the key quotes in the book, you have to go through a lot. And it can be very boring at times, but it's worth it in the end. And then I listen to Xi Jinping speeches and other Chinese officials. And then, and I think this is the key part, is actually watch what they do, right? To try to match their written statements or their spoken statements with real world behavior. Because it's one thing to say something, it's an entirely different thing to actually spend a lot of money or build entire new organizations or reform yourself structurally to do those things. And so if you look at One Belt, One Road, or now it's called the BRI initiative, for example, if you look at the PLA reforms, the way they've reformed structurally, as another example, if you look at behavioral patterns, so it's one thing for Xi Jinping to say he's a huge fan of Marxism. He's a student of Marx. He believes that Karl Marx is the greatest thinker who ever walked the face of the earth. Okay. Seems a little strange, but that's what he says. But then he shows up to major speeches in a Mao suit, right? And then what does that tell us? Then he starts to fund national movements in China and around the world to teach Marxism everywhere. Then he funds the establishment of a massive 2-ton bronze statue in Marx's hometown. Okay, now I think we have some data points that suggest maybe he really is a Marxist. Maybe he really does believe this stuff. Maybe it's not just something that he's saying because it's politically expedient.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for laying that out in terms of, not only reading the documents, but, listening to what they say, but also observing the patterns of their behaviors as well as being a sort of a more holistic manner of, sort of analyzing and really coming to a conclusion with regards to what you consider to be their intent. I think, one could perhaps, sort of if they were a cynic, try to say, well, that could be, cherry picking analysis, right? You're just selecting, but you're looking at a broad range of documents here, and that's what something that really impressed me when I was going through the bibliography, which is what I always do when I go read a book, is I look through the book about what are the resources, right? And then looking through all those documents that you have cited, 13 plus, and these authoritative, government documents that speaks to, and then weaving that through in terms of the, what Xi Jinping himself has said in a lot of public speeches that he's made, in addition to the behaviors that they have engaged in, and then being able to bring that all together. Give our audience a taste here, as how much of what we're seeing right now is that the result of one man, Xi Jinping? Could it change after Xi?
I think there's a bedtime story that we tell ourselves to comfort ourselves, because obviously nobody likes the direction that China has gone in. It's very, very stunning, shocking, surprising. Nobody, if you would have, if we could all in this room go in a time capsule or a time machine and go back 10 years into the past and tell people, or even 5 years into the past, and tell people China was going to build concentration camps in Xinjiang and start committing genocide. And they were going to crack down on Hong Kong in the fashion that they have done, that they were going to invest incredible resources into their military, the likes, and engage in military buildup, the likes of which we've never seen in peacetime. No other country in at least 100 years has had such a sustained and rapid military buildup as the People's Republic of China does today. If you could say, well, Xi Jinping is not going to act at all like Hu Jintao, we're not going to have him for 10 years. We're going to have him maybe for his whole life. We now are going to have a Mao-like dictator. And that's something that we started to see indications of at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And I believe we're definitely going to see it this fall at the 20th Party Congress. It's going to be crystal clear. No one would believe you. If you said all of that, or if you took a book like this, or any of the other great books that have been written, and took that back in time, no one would believe that. It really is incredible. It seems unbelievable. And so why? Is this about Xi Jinping, or is this about the Chinese Communist Party? I think it's both. I think it's both. And so I think it would be very comforting to say, well, if something happens to Xi Jinping, maybe the man has a health issue, or maybe something else should happen to him, then we can go back to the China that we thought we had before him, and everything they'll start to mellow out. I'm not at all convinced that that's the case. And I think the China that we thought we had before Xi Jinping was actually not the China we wanted either. We were still in denial. I think every transition that we've had from Deng to Jiang, from Jiang to Hu, from Hu to Xi Jinping, there's always this desire to think, and of course I saw this as a young China analyst back before the 18th Party Congress, there's a desire to think, this guy's going to be the one. He's going to be the one that's going to mellow out. He's going to be a reformer. He's going to tamp down the military buildup and the militarism and the ultranationalism, and we're finally going to be able to have the China that we always wanted, a China that was much more humanistic and rational and cooperative, that behaves like what we consider a normal country to behave as. And it's never been the case, and I don't think it will be the case after Xi Jinping. I think he's more of a symptom of the problem than the source of the problem. And the problem, I think, is the Chinese Communist Party. Anytime you have a Marxist-Leninist organization like that, that's in control of a country that's as powerful as China is, you're in for a lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because as I was reading your book, I was definitely reminded of Jude Blanchett's book that he wrote, and this is a fantastic book on China's, and he's currently at CSIS right now as one of these, it's a Freeman shareholder, but his book on China's New Red Guards, right, the return of radicalism and the rebirth of Mao Zedong. And so while he, really focused on the sort of internal ideological manifestations of this return of radicalism within the party, right? I think your book sort of reflects on how that externalized, and that's sort of that external manifestation of this internal ideological underpinnings. And so I think, that's an interesting explanation how you think that this is beyond Xi Jinping himself. He's probably the symptoms of this trend that's been building up, that Blanchard had also, I think really accurately described and documented in his, really good study on this that he did. And so it kind of builds on that. So a key point that you seem to make in the book is that whether we like it or not, China sees the state of U.S.-China relations as an ideological struggle, right? Explain.
Yeah, absolutely. We are in a war of ideas, whether we know it or not, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. This is an ideological struggle. And you don't have to believe me, and you should. Go read Xi Jinping thought. Go read it. Go read any of the documents that I cite there. Go read the textbooks that they're giving to Chinese students, all the way from graduate school to university to high school, all the way down to elementary school. Listen to Xi Jinping in his own language. Don't read the bad, Xinhua, People's Daily translations in English, because what they'll do is that's propaganda. That's real propaganda. And they will change words, they'll soften things, and they will analyze it and twist it in such a way where you're like, oh, that's not so bad. No, you got to read it in the original. And when you do, Xi Jinping says some things, and I spent a lot of time reading his writings and listening to him speak, and other officials as well. It sounds crazy. It is very, very hostile. It's an active, conscious denial of human rights, individual freedom, everything the United States of America stands for, rule of law, universal values. It's actively saying that does not exist. That is false. What does exist is Marxist-Leninist thought. And our intention is to collectivize everything and to build this socialist superpower and to spread our socialist ideas. And by the way, when Xi Jinping talks about socialism, he's not talking about the liberal democratic socialism that's practiced very, very successfully in Northern Europe, right? Or in Taiwan, for that matter. I mean, Taiwan has some very wonderful social programs, very socialistic. That's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about a one-party dictatorship, a totalitarian model of governance. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party has put into practice. And that's what he now rules. And he's spreading that. That's his objective, is to spread that. And that means the destruction, at first the erosion of democracy, and then ultimately the destruction of democracy. And when he describes, in Mandarin, when they describe the United States of America, the term that they use is the strong enemy, 强敌, right? It's not the kinds of soft terms that we use, the polite terms that we use in Washington. Oh, China is a competitor, right? If we say they're a rival or they're an adversary, we kind of feel guilty. Oh, that's a little too strong now. No. They in Mandarin, the Chinese Communist Party, when they refer to the United States of America, it's their number one enemy. And they have a special animosity towards U.S. military and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. That's their, if the United States is their main enemy, these guys are the tip of the spear. And it is very hostile.
I want to stay on this topic a little bit, and I want to dig in because I think this is where I think the framing of this ideological struggle is central to, the premise of your book. And I want to give the audience a broader understanding about, this ideological struggle in the broader context of the role of international institutions. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays out?
Yeah, and so this is one of the areas where we see this war of ideas playing out is at the United Nations and a United Nations affiliate organization. So under the United Nations, there are a number of organizations that their purpose is to advance good governance, right? The United Nations was designed by the United States and the United Kingdom primarily in the wake of World War II. And it was to create a world where countries were treated as sovereign equals. It was going to be inclusive. And the idea was to make sure that you never had another fascist regime like Nazi Germany or the Empire of Japan or another communist regime that's attempting world domination, that they believe the rules don't apply, that might makes right. And if they're more powerful than their weaker, smaller neighbor, they can just invade that neighbor, right? That was not a world we wanted to live in anymore. We saw what that meant in the 1930s and 1940s. And so the purpose, I think, of the United Nations was ultimately to improve the quality of human rights and good governance around the world. Now, the United Nations is doing something very different because you have Chinese government officials and Chinese Communist Party members sitting in leadership positions on organizations that are deciding the future of the internet, the International Telecommunications Union, for example, where you have a Chinese government official who's running that, making sure that a company like Huawei, which for all intents and purposes is an arm of the People's Liberation Army and the Ministry of State Security, making sure that everything runs on Huawei, that Huawei dominates the future of telecommunications, 5G and 6G, spreading that around, sitting on the United Nations affiliates bodies that are meant to govern human rights. And so now we have different definitions coming out on, oh, well, what is genocide in Xinjiang? That's not genocide, that's something else. Even though legal studies have found that the Chinese Communist Party is violating every single convention of the 1947 Convention on Genocide, right? And so these are some of the examples of how this is playing out. I have a chapter here that also talks about how this played out during the pandemic in 2020 and in 2021. I don't want to give it away, but the relationship with the World Health Organization and China's government is pretty interesting story.
Yeah, I want to stay on this just a little bit more because, again, like I said earlier, I think this is really a really important element of your work. But also on the there's not another day that passes by that semiconductors technology and the high tech space doesn't come up in discussions about the future of the of the international community. And so how does the world technology factor into ideological competition with China and who's Carl?
Who's Carl? Carl is an acronym that I made up. The Central Automated Records Litigator, which is so okay. So the background to this is in one of the chapters of the book, I talk about what China is doing in the technology space, what the Chinese Communist Party is writing about, what Xi Jinping has to say about the future of the internet. And the story that Xi Jinping tells is that we are now at the cusp, thanks to big data analytics, artificial intelligence, and all the applications that flow from that, the interconnectivity that we all have through our devices and our reliance on the internet for everything, that this is a breakout moment for the future of human societies. And so if you want to create a collective, you want to collectivize the world, and you want to spread your ideas, and you want to control the way people act and what they think and what they do and what they don't do, as we've seen in the COVID lockdowns in Shanghai and elsewhere, then you have to control that space. And you can do that through software, you can do that through hardware, you can do that through controlling the key bodies, the international bodies that, like the International Telecommunications Union, that are supposed to govern that space. You can make sure that industries under your control, companies like Huawei and ZTE, that they dominate that around the world. And then what do? You can use that to spread your model of governance. And you can have almost limitless almost a limitless ability to coerce people into doing what you want them to do. And this is how the Chinese Communist Party has stayed in power in China. And they're helping other dictatorships around the world do this as well. And so the story, so it got me thinking about, okay, if this is what they're attempting to do, this is what they want to do, This is what they're writing about in their textbooks, and this is what their long-range planning documents say. What would that actually look like? You know, here in Washington, we have war game after war game after war game where we talk about what a future Chinese invasion of Taiwan or a blockade of Taiwan, what might that look like? I remember 5 years ago, it wasn't Taiwan, it was all about the South China Sea or the Senkakus, the Diaoyutai Islands and the East China Sea. And it's all military all the time. It's all kinetic all the time. I'm not aware of other exercises that think through what a conflict might look like in these other domains, the economic domain, the technology domain, the ideological domain. And so there's a chapter in there that I put on so this is nonfiction, but I put on my fiction, my novel or my wannabe novel writer hat, and I develop a scenario. And the scenario walks the reader through what a future war between the US and China might look like on the home front here in America. So not talking about the kinetic thing, but talking about what that might look like here in the technological space and in the social space. And then I also talk about, okay, what if there's never a fight, right? Because that's the goal of strategy, is to make sure you never have a war in the first place. What if there's never a fight, but what if China is successful? What if they actually are able to dominate the future of the internet and the future of e-commerce and the future of all telecommunications technologies that we use and dominate the narrative? Well, what does that look like? And so I walk through another scenario of what that looked like. And so to Russell's question, that's where Carl comes from. Carl is kind of an Orwellian artificial intelligence system that, you know, in the next decade or two will emerge and that will know us all far better than we know ourselves because it's been collecting all of our data and it can manipulate us. And it uses very powerful micro-targeting tools to do that. There's actually a really good documentary on Netflix about some of the early versions of this. It's called The Great Hack, about Cambridge Analytica and how they've gotten into the space a little bit to apply some of these tools so they can manipulate elections. But it goes much, much farther than that. And so it's speculative, of course. Nobody knows what the future will bring. And the idea is to make sure this kind of future never, ever happens. But I think it's useful for us to sometimes think through it and to think about these types of different scenarios so we can see it in concrete ways. So that's what the chapter tries to do.
That's excellent. There seems to be a growing consensus in Washington, D.C. that we are in a competitive, relationship with China, but there seems to be still disagreements within the policy community about the exact nature of that competition, right? So, for instance, we had Ryan Haas a few months ago for a book talk on his book about competitive interdependence, which covers a lot on U.S.-China relations. There's a very thoughtful, analysis about the strengths of the United States in this competition. And he framed the U.S.-China relationship as one of competitive interdependence. And I think that there's a lot of, sort of different, sort of type of models that people have described to this relationship that frames it. And so how would you frame the relationship then?
I'm not smart enough to have a model, or I'm not academic enough. I don't have a PhD. So I'm not sure that I have a point of phrase. I think others have described it as a systemic, what is the term of art? It's a systemic challenge that we have.
Yeah.
It's systemic competition. So it's in every domain. I think that's probably the most accurate way.
Strategic competition.
Strategic competition,
right? Yeah.
But it's not just about power politics, or it's not just a military issue or an intelligence issue. This is system-wide. This is every domain of the human experience. The Chinese Communist Party is looking for dominance. And so we might not be in that fight. We may not view some of these areas as competitive spaces. So, for example, here in the United States, we don't generally think of trade, except in times of war. We don't think of trade as something to fight about. We think of trade as a way to develop a good relationship and commerce. These are things that we think of in positive terms. The Chinese Communist Party does not. They view that as a competitive space. They view themselves as in a constant economic war with countries like the United States. Same with technology. We tend to think of technology and applications of technology as something that is a net good, is positive. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't see that at all. They think that they have to dominate that and control that. And if that they don't, then they might not survive. For them, it's a matter of life and death. Can you imagine in China if the media was not controlled, if the internet was not controlled, if there was no great firewall of China, what would that mean for the future of the Chinese Communist Party? Could they survive? I don't think so, and they don't think so either. And so this is these are examples of how it's a systemic challenge that we face.
Okay, then in that context of a systemic challenge or competition, what does winning look like to you then?
Well, winning, I think, looks like what we saw at the end of the first Cold War, is where you have a period of intense great power competition. It is system-wide and is viewed as such. And at the end, the United States remains a flourishing democracy. And we have our civil liberties and our right to the freedom of speech. And we remain an economic powerhouse with all the prosperity that our country is able to produce. And then our adversary, that regime, does not survive. That ultimately, if the Chinese Communist Party survives for another 30 or 40 or 50 years, the way the Soviet Union could have survived, if the United States had not had a good strategy throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union could still be around today. We could be living in a much darker and more dangerous world than we are. But we're not, because we had generations of very good strategic thinkers. If we can learn from that. We can learn from that experience. So I think ultimately that is the end. That would be the end of strategic competition, is the Chinese Communist Party would cease to exist, and you would have you'd have progress politically, you'd have actual political reform, you'd have multiple parties in power, and you would have an evolution from where they are today.
Well, you alluded to just now, you referenced several times in your book that you think we're in a new Cold War, right? And how do we keep this Cold War from getting hot?
That's true. I do think we're in a new Cold War with the People's Republic of China, whether we want to admit it or not. And obviously, if you watch Secretary of State Blinken's recent China speech, he actively said, we are not seeking a new Cold War with China. And I think that's true. The last thing that the United States government wants is a new Cold War, right? But it doesn't matter because of the regime that we're up against. They are very much in a Cold War with us. And so if we don't recognize that, and if we don't prepare accordingly to make sure that we can maintain our dominance in these different areas, economic, technological, narrative, ideology, and of course military as well, then that actually makes the risk of conflict much, much greater. The reason we never had a fight with the Soviet Union is because after World War II, you had a generation of Americans who were all traumatized. All those guys that fought in World War II had nightmares until the day they died, even if they lived into their 90s. And I knew some of them. They were so traumatized because they knew what great power war looked like. They knew it. They saw it. It was visceral for them. It was emotional for them. And they could see in their mind's eye what World War III with the Soviet Union would look like. And so they were desperate to make sure that that never happened. And they would go to great lengths to make sure that that would never, ever happen so that we can maintain deterrence. What is deterrence? It's a fancy Pentagon word for war prevention. So we would always make sure as a country that we had dominance at the conventional level of warfare and at the nuclear level of warfare. And that we would not, there would be certain lines that we would not allow the Soviets to cross. And we would signal in very strong terms, very clearly, what those lines were and what the consequences would be if they did cross them. Today, we're in a position where we are very rapidly losing our conventional overmatch. And in the next 10 years, we could lose our nuclear overmatch as well. And nobody's sure where those lines are either. And so we risk kind of walking blindly into a war with China because we're not even thinking about how to prevent it in the first place. And we're also not thinking about all those other domains that China is seeking to dominate, and in some cases successfully has dominated. There are places in the technology space, in the economic space, and in other areas where they have been working very, very hard to achieve their strategic goals, and we have not been in the game. And so I think that's the key part of it.
I want to be considerate of the audience members that we have, here with us, and I do want to get to some of your questions if you have some. And so I just want to tee that up for you and let you know that I'm going to still wrap up. I have a few more questions that I want to get, across to Ian while I have him in the hot seat. And but I want to let you know that we will take questions from the audience, in a short bit. So you created what you call a top-level measures of strategic advantage and growth. Give our audience a brief overview of these measures and what their significance is. And in a way, it reads a bit about like a call for a national intelligence estimate about China's strategic competition capabilities. I don't know if we have one or not, but how do you match it up, right? And well, I mean, just give the overview and then why it's significant.
Well, so there's this chapter. One of the questions that when people talk about U.S.-China strategic competition, there's always this discussion of, is China 10 feet tall and 6 feet tall? Is it 5 feet tall? Like, where is it? And how tall are we? And who's ahead here? And who's stronger? And how would you know? And so I had a chapter where I go through this thought exercise of how would you know? How would we know who's actually ahead? How do you do that kind of net assessment where you look at where you are, where the other guy is, and where you're headed? What are the trends in all the different areas of competition? And what are the kinds of questions you would want to have answered to make those kinds of judgments? What can you quantify? There are things that we can quantify, right? Economics, you can quantify. Military spending, you can quantify. It's very, very difficult to do, especially in the case of China. But at least these are analytic questions that you can put out there and you can make attempts to do it. There are other things you can't quantify, maybe because they're classified. I mean, who's ahead? Which country, China or the United States, has a better covert action portfolio in Southeast Asia, right? Who has more agents in the other sides? Can, right? Or in Africa, or in Central and South America. I don't know. We can't say, right? That's all stuff that happens on the high side behind the veil. And maybe we don't know what they have and they don't know what we have. So you can't actually quantify any of that. Who's ahead in bleeding edge technology areas like quantum? Who can say, right? Who's making the types of investments in education and in R&D that are going to produce the next generation of brilliant strategic thinkers and economists and scientists and everything that you would need to be successful over the long run? Who's making those investments? And how do you judge it? And how do you know if the investments you're making today are going to have a payoff 10 years or 20 years from now? Who has a better vision for the future? Who knows what they want the future to look like? Who is mobilizing their government and their society around that vision of the future so they can see it through? And so there's this chapter, and I'm afraid there are a lot more questions than I have answers. And what answers I do have to some of the things that can be quantified are very speculative. I mean, when you look at trying to compare military spending, for example, it's very, very speculative. And so this is again one of these chapters where it's a thought exercise. It's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. But I think these are the types of questions that we're going to want to have answers to in the coming years. These are the kinds of things that I hope we start to study and to think much more about, instead of just focusing on missiles and ships and things that are very, very simplistic and bean counting. There's a whole other universe of competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And we need to get at that and not just be overly fixated on one little galaxy. And I think that's where we are today. We're focused on one galaxy and we're missing the whole universe of the competition.
Well, since we're GTI here, I'm going to have to conclude with a question about Taiwan. So you argue in your book that the survivability of Taiwan should be a metric to judge whether the United States is successfully competing with China. Why?
Yeah, so in that chapter, there are a number of different metrics or a number of different things, and then I talk about why I think some of them matter more than others. I think Taiwan matters a great deal. It matters a great deal. And this is one of the most immediate concerns of the U.S. government and the U.S. military, and it should be for the entire country and our allies as well, is because the future of Taiwan will decide the future of war and peace in our time. There is no other place on the planet where you could see superpowers go to war. There's no other place like that. And so we absolutely need to make sure that we are able to deter that conflict, we're able to prevent that conflict, that we're able to defend Taiwan, and credibly signal that we will defend Taiwan to make sure that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party elite is never actually tempted to provoke a war and to make a move on Taiwan. If we don't get that right, then a lot of this other stuff won't matter, because we will be in a great power war. We'll be in another war, and it could be far worse than World War II. I mean, just in the way that at the end of World War I, people call it the Great War. Nobody ever thought something that terrible, that catastrophic could ever happen again. And then World War II comes along, generation later, and it's exponentially worse. Exponentially, an order of magnitude worse in terms of civilian deaths and battlefield deaths and economic destruction. And it was just so much worse. And then people started to think about what World War III would look like. Again, another order of magnitude. So we absolutely have to make sure that we can deter China from attacking Taiwan. If we fail at that, then wherever else we're successful in the world, it won't matter all that much, because we will have failed at that issue that matters the most.
Okay, and thank you so much for answering all those questions. I have a lot more questions that I haven't gone through yet, but again, I want to be considerate of our audience members who are here to listen and participate in this session. So I want to take a few questions from our audience here. When you get the microphone, please state your name as well as your affiliation, and please try to keep your questions or comments, probably a question brief. Okay. All right. This gentleman here. We have someone running the mics. Yeah.
My name is Paul Jacob. I'm with Liberty Initiative Fund. I loved your book, The Final Struggle. Stopped about 12 times to say, that's exactly right. That's what I've been thinking. But I, previous to that, read your book about the Chinese invasion threat. And I think that's actually an even more important book for this reason. So often I talk to people in the United States, and their view, without any real knowledge of the situation, is that China can't be stopped from invading and taking Taiwan. And reading your book, I think it's obvious that it can be stopped, and that China recognizes its problems with attacking Taiwan and invading. And I wonder, how can we get the information in your book out to more people? Because the ambiguity is, I think, feeds into this idea that maybe it can't be done, and people don't attempt to do things that they don't think are possible. I think that if the United States is unambiguously behind defending Taiwan, that China never attacks. And so that's my question. How do we get your previous book's message out to more people?
Well, thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate that. I don't know the answer. I wish I did. I wish I had a magic wand, and it would give me some magical ability to be able to go out and tour America and talk to people, and or to write a novel that communicates it, so it's more entertaining. And sometimes I worry that the book is maybe a little too long or a little too wonky, and it will, people, their eyes will glaze over at a certain point. And so that was one of the reasons why when I wrote The Final Struggle, I reached out to some artists that I knew, um, and asked them if they would be willing, if we could commission, if my institute, the Project 2049 Institute, could commission some original artwork and get maps and get infographics, and get drawings, very high definition artistic renderings of some of this stuff, because it can be so abstract, right? It can be very wonky, but when you see it, I mean, a picture really does tell 1,000 words. Sometimes a picture is worth 10,000 words. And I also tried to do a little bit more reading about how you do narrative nonfiction, how to tell a story, and how to package information, which can be very dry if you just share it like a Wikipedia page, right? How to actually tell the story so that readers are drawn into the story, and then as they experience the story, they also hopefully will learn something along the way. In the same way that as a researcher, when I'm doing the research and I'm reading all of these very dry documents, I'll read it and then I'll watch a speech, or I'll see a parade, or I'll, see a military exercise or something, and then it'll just crystallize and it'll come together. And so I think ultimately what we need are more organizations like Global Taiwan Institute, more think tanks, more discussion. But I don't know. I don't know what the magic bullet is to share a lot of this kind of information. But I really appreciate your kind remarks.
Thanks for the books.
Right. A gentleman over there. Thank you.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Somewhere around 1950, we looked down the highway and saw that there was no sane future with the long-term existence and success of the Soviet Communist Party. And we acted accordingly in all sorts of realms. Major investments in information operations. And 45 years later, wow, 2 generations to work. When do we make that decision for the Communist Party of China? Because we sure as hell have not made that decision. And I don't see the buckets of resources going into breaking the Great Firewall, which, once broken, will break the party as well.
It's such a good question. And I've wondered the same. How did we get to this world that we're in today? I'll just share this quick story. So there was a moment in the pandemic, early days of the pandemic, where I find out, I'm going to be working online now for maybe years, for as far as I can see. My wife is going to be teaching online. My kids are going to be going to school online. And I'm not ready for that at all. I've got to prepare for this digital future. I've got to get my house wired, and I've got to get, cameras and more computers for the kids and all this stuff. And so I go to Best Buy. I live out in Northern Virginia, and I go to my local Best Buy, and I've got the masks on, I've got the gloves on, and I'm making sure I'm going to social distance from everybody. I'm very, very nervous, and I feel like I'm in one of those zombie apocalypse movies where I'm one of the last guys on the planet, because there's nobody. Parking lot is empty. There's no traffic, and it's rush hour. It's what a few months before had been rush hour gridlock traffic in that area. There's nobody. I'm the only guy in the Best Buy. And it's absolutely quiet, and it's eerie. And so I walked around the store and I looked at the smart TVs, the kinds of TVs that you can talk to. They're connected to the internet. You can talk to them. You can tell them, hey, I want to go to such and such a channel, or Netflix, or Amazon Prime, or whatever it may be. I looked at the laptops, the desktops, the drones, the home security systems, the white goods. So appliances like your washer, dryer, washing machine, heater, and it's all connected to the internet via IoT, the Internet of Things, this technology. And I started to see that they were all made in China, but that's normal. but they were all made by companies affiliated with the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese Communist Party, literally state-owned enterprises. So GE Home, for example, they were bought out by Haier, which is a Chinese state-owned enterprise. So when Americans go buy GE appliances, washer, dryer, microwave, whatever it may be, they're literally taking their own money and they're giving it to China's government because that's what they are now. When you go buy Lenovo dominates the home computer space. Lenovo has been blacklisted by the Pentagon for their known connections to the PLA. Lenovo was founded by a former PLA officer, former Chinese government official. And it's that way across the entire technology ecosystem. So how did we get to this world where Americans are investing our own money into the success of the Chinese military and the Chinese government, when we're supposed to be, according to the National Security Strategy of 2017, we're supposed to be in strategic competition? How did that happen, right? That's the key question. Now, sir, your question was about when do we reach a moment where we're like, okay, this is enough. We're not going to be doing business anymore with our adversary, our rival. The way we reached that moment in the late 1940s, where we're like, yeah, we're not going to do business with the Soviets anymore. We're going to actually seek to isolate them. That took some very, very dangerous brinksmanship. I mean, the Berlin crisis in 48 and 49 was, I think, a key turning point in American foreign policy, where a lot of people realized, holy smokes, these guys are not, this is not the government, this is not the regime we thought they were. In World War II, they were our allies. When we thought we could have a United Nations and world peace was going to break out at the end and now they're cutting us off from Berlin and going right to the brink with them and engaging in nuclear blackmail. I think there are those moments, there are those turning points where you do have a crisis and you come to the brink of an abyss and you look over the side and you think about what it would mean to go over. You say, no way. We've not come to that point. Happily, we've not come to that point with China. There has not been a moment where we as a nation have felt ourselves approaching the brink of a potential war with China. There have been other moments that you could say may have been Sputnik moments, but they weren't. So, just as an example, the cover-up of the COVID-19 outbreak in the early days of 2020, that could have been a Sputnik moment, a wake-up moment, and it turned out not to be. The revelations of genocide in Xinjiang could have been a Sputnik moment, but it turned out not to be. So for whatever reason, we've not reached that place yet. But I think, unfortunately, we will. I think it's coming. And when we do, then I think we're likely to see a replay of some of those Cold War strategies. And it's going to be so much more difficult and dangerous than it was during the Cold War. Yeah. Because the Chinese Communist Party is far more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was. And they're so much more sophisticated and so much smarter than the Soviets ever were. And when you look at some of their long-range planning documents, and when you look at what they've accomplished strategically, it's eye-watering and it's almost chilling. We're dealing with a rival the likes of which we've never faced before.
Well, with that, fortunately, I think we've exhausted all the time that we have here with our with Ian. And so thank you very much, Ian, for joining us and coming to talk to our audience here, as well as both in person as well as online. If you haven't purchased a copy of The Final Struggle, they are available for purchase here and are right out in the front by the front door. And you can also purchase them online on Amazon. So please purchase a copy. What we've discussed here today really only scratches the surface of the depth of the issues that were highlighted in this discussion. So, and this Final Struggle really reads not only as a really a deep analytical piece about the inner thinkings of the Chinese Communist Party and its global strategy, but it's also a call to action as well. And so, thank you very much, Ian, for writing this book and for being here with us today.